This week on the Jerusalem Post podcast, the podcast is joined by chairman of Yad Vashem, Dani Dayan, to discuss the Holocaust, our remembrance today, and what it means to remember an atrocity that occurred so many years ago in a time like today. This is the Jerusalem Post podcast. I'm your host, Tamar Uriel-Beeri, editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Report, and I'm joined, as I so often am, by Eve Young.
Hello.
Economics extraordinaire of the
And
Jerusalem
domestic affairs.
And domestic affairs. Can't forget domestic affairs. How are you, Eve?
Good. I'm glad to be here again. Love it.
I feel like lately it's usually you hosting me and not the opposite. This feels like a fun little reversal that we're doing.
Well, yeah, I mean, we haven't officially told the readers, but I am now the multimedia economics and domestic affairs reporter.
This is true. So
Lots of focus on videos.
So we've done a lot of video content together talking about, specifically with Trump's tariffs we did recently. Not so recently, but yeah.
Yeah.
Lots to talk about there, but also lots to talk about that happened this week. I think, obviously, the biggest locally is Ronen Bar's affidavit. I never know how to pronounce that word.
I actually feel like both are right.
Are they?
And
is
yes,
it like vase and vase?
I think so. Affidavit. No, actually, I think
It's affidavit.
It's affidavit.
Yeah,
Anyway.
Anyway.
That is the biggest news this week, I'd say.
Anyway, on that affidavit that he submitted to the court, basically saying, going hard at Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, including criticizing him of forcing him into a corner and saying you have to support me in a word, but specifically saying you have to target civilians, including people who haven't committed crimes, including protest leaders, for example. He gave very specific examples. I think it's an 11-page document, something like that. And it has caused quite a stir because it's obviously a very, very public legal battle. Oh, I think also another thing that he said was that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tried to get him to sign a document saying that he could not testify in court. The irony not lost upon anybody here. And, if this is all... So now Netanyahu is expected to submit his affidavit kind of in response to that, but also kind of defending himself in this situation. But if this is all true, and if this is something that can be proven in a court of law in some capacity... A, this is another huge legal battle that Netanyahu has in his hands. And B, this is another huge accusation of major crime and what's the word I'm looking for?
Corruption. Yeah, absolutely. This is
in the Prime Minister's office.
Yeah.
And this is also at the time when Netanyahu isn't directly at this point involved in all the Qatargate investigations, but it's all the people who surround him closest.
Yeah, I think it's weird to say that he's not directly involved, just because it's if it's your three closest advisors,
it's your three closest advisors. He has technically testified in behind closed doors, but he has not formally and publicly been charged. Nobody's been charged at this point. People are under investigation.
But he's not under direct investigation.
But he's not under a direct investigation. Yeah, so. But still, it's if it's an apple rotten in its core. If all of this that's come to light is true, it's corruption internally in terms of domestic affairs and domestic security, because we're talking about Shin Bet. It's the same thing if the submarine case were to follow through. It's an issue of security-based corruption. And it's the same thing externally, because Qatargate is referring to external relations with a foreign entity that's literally supporting the terrorist group that orchestrated October 7th.
So, the affidavits are the next step, we should also say, in the firing case of Ronen Bar.
Yes.
The affidavits,
that's
what they're submitted as part of. And I really, I agree with what you're saying, that we're talking about, it's just it's kind of 3 or 4 years ago, this would have been absolutely unbelievable.
Right.
These accusations would have been... Remember, when the first kind of accusations about, or rumors about how the Shin Bet is used to track civilians came out during Corona?
Yeah.
And caused uproar?
With, was that...
It was just as part of the discussion of kind of how they could track...
Yeah.
Phone tapping, exactly. How they could track different, patients and carriers and suspected carriers.
Yeah.
So that caused an uproar. And this is, I think, has, again, the same aspect of the Shin Bet being used against civilians, but it's 100-fold, right?
Yeah.
And
I think realistically, if this had come to light around the same time that, you know, even though it obviously hadn't happened yet, supposedly, if it even did happen. But if this kind of thing had come to light at the same time that the indictment against Netanyahu was presented then by then Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit, he would have resigned on the spot.
I don't know. I would like to think so, but it's like at this stage, you see scandal after scandal after scandal. And it's like, these are scandals that previous leaders would have absolutely resigned over. Even if they were innocent, they would have said, like, it's kind of like a Caesar's wife situation. Like, we must be above suspicion. But yeah, I agree with you that, like, we're talking about something that is a huge landslide. If even one of these accusations are true, landslide. But we're joining into like 5 other landslides, right? Like the fact that his closest advisors are suspected of colluding with a foreign entity, with Qatar.
Yeah.
Huge. The fact that he is facing 3 trials and that ministers in Israel are not allowed to continue to be ministers while indicted for crimes. He has continued because he's the prime minister and says the law doesn't apply to him because he's the prime minister. Like, what, like, how many more landslides are we going to get? You know what I mean? And I think that joins in kind of like a much bigger context Israelis are living in now, which is just this absolute like breaching of all barriers, all red lines kind of feel like they've been crossed. Like what, like it's very much a moment of like, what is going on? And also who's actually surprised, because look at all the other accusations and cases and question marks stacked up against him. And we should also say it's not just against Netanyahu.
Right.
It's against really Israel's leadership as a whole. There are hardly any institutions that inspire any confidence in Israelis these days. Like the IDF is kind of one of the last standing institutions that still inspires trust.
And it had a break in that trust at first because of October 7th. Only now do people kind of say, okay, but we're not looking at the institution, we're looking at specific leaders, both in and outside of the IDF, when it comes to looking for blame. And there's you know, I remember back then when there was this argument, and even I wrote an article in support of it at the time, saying now's not the time for pointing fingers and naming names and putting blame. Now's the time for just focused action. And in hindsight, I regret writing that, because I think that from the very beginning, like a level of self-awareness nationally is necessary in general, but that kind of awareness, acute awareness, even especially actually in those beginning stages, I think is hyper important, so that we know who needs to be pushing things forward, who needs to be moving forward, and even from that point.
Even if we accept that argument, that statement, that idea that like we shouldn't investigate now, we just have to react. Because October 7th truly was an incident that the main reason I regret the argument is just it's just a way to like put the major problem on the side, in order to distract until people aren't mad anymore. There's a lot to be said for that, absolutely. But there is something to be said for the fact that like the country was in absolute survival mode and people just needed to survive. But we're a year and a half later. That's not the case anymore. And it's exactly what you said would happen. What you just mentioned now is being a fear, where it's like we've put aside taking responsibility and truly examining core issues and put them aside for so long that some of the electorate has forgotten, and some just don't have the momentum anymore to actually bring this about. And also, of course, it creates the incentive to keep the emergency going. If the emergency is a reason to not look for those responsible, the emergency is an excuse. The emergency becomes incentivized.
Yeah. Actually, yesterday I met a Nova survivor who told me her story. And it was a context in which I didn't expect to meet a Nova survivor, and it was so amazing. And it reminded me again of how much we really need to keep in mind how much civilian action was so prevalent, setting aside the other side of that coin, that didn't need to be the case, that it should have been security forces protecting Israel and preventing this in the first place. But switching over to that side, it truly like was amazing. Her story, in very short, she was at the Nova Music Festival, 6:30 a.m., siren sound. And her sister calls her because her sister knows that she's very afraid of rocket sirens. She was in one of Israel's previous wars, a reservist, and she's very afraid. And her sister called her and she said, "Yeah, I'm fine. We're heading out now." And then as they're like in that line of traffic that everybody was stuck in on the way out of Nova, they just start seeing people running. And she gets out with her friends and understands, because somebody like screamed at mechablim, terrorists. They just started running, and they ran for 4.5 hours straight until eventually they were hiding in a farm, I think like an avocado farm. And this man who I didn't look this up beforehand, and I know whoever this is has been in the news quite a bit. His name is Rami, and at first they thought it was a terrorist because he was in a Jeep.
Wow.
But then he pulled up to them and said, like, I'm Israeli. I can get you. I'm evacuating as many people as possible. Do you want to go to an army base or oh my God, I don't remember. Like it was a different option, an army base or like a police station or a hospital or something like that. And they were like, okay, what's the safest thing? An army base, not knowing that a bunch of army bases were infiltrated. At this point, she was with two of her friends, and then they had to run into two injured people, one who was shot in the shoulder, one who was shot in the rib. And they get to the base, they are helping them, and they're trying to get over the gate because they see that at the main gate, there are terrorists shooting in. They don't know at this point that there are, whatever base this is, it's one of the ones fully infiltrated.
Oh no.
So the base is full of terrorists. They don't know this. They try to go around and climb over the gate, and because of the injured people, they could not get over. And in the end, they asked this guy Rami to drive them instead to the police station. And thank God he did, because that base was completely overrun by terrorists.
Wow.
And they almost definitely would have died. And they got to police. The ones who were injured got to a hospital, and everybody else got to go home. But it was like a really, really inspiring story, and a very long-winded way for me to bring this up on a podcast to just say, remembering those civilians who did so much kind of reminds me of the amazing spirit of like when you have like those inspiring stories about the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto and stuff like that, like those like community people who were just doing the most within the Jewish community, even though they were suffering too.
I was like, how did we get here? Like, how did we get to hearing a story about Nova, which like always is so important to hear?
Yeah.
But it is this thread that ties directly from the failures of the government and the refusal to take accountability and responsibility for these failures, and the refusal to examine and look at like the deep core problems that have led to the situation where the civilians truly have had to like take control and be the masters of their own fate. And that is not tenable. Now, it's incredible to watch. It's the Israeli spirit and people managing to do this. And the stories of heroism, they're unbelievable. But this is absolutely wrong. It shouldn't be this way.
Yeah, it should not be this way.
We shouldn't be hearing the head of the Shin Bet, essentially Israel's CIA,
right,
or FBI, or both, saying, the prime minister told me that in the case of a constitutional crisis, I am expected to be on his side, not the court side.
Yeah.
The fact that he put like the Shin Bets, he was expected to use the Shin Bet against protesters. These are just unbelievable, unacceptable things. Yeah. And the fact that they're joining other unacceptable things that we don't have answers on is just boggling.
And you know,
it can't last.
Like supposedly it's not working within the Shin Bet, right? Like it's like that kind of action that he's trying to take isn't working. If he did try to take it, isn't working in the Shin Bet. But for example, in systems like the Israel police, where we're seeing like really horrible cases of police violence that are being addressed, but they're happening so often that like you could say you're addressing it ad le'odah chadasha until next year, but if there are so many cases, this is a systemic issue. And then you have to ask, where is that coming from?
And let's not forget that the Shin Bet just recently had another kind of little small scandal. I don't think it's actually small, but there was like another case with the Shin Bet where a high-level Shin Bet official is being investigated for possibly turning over confidential information, secret security information, to a minister.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard to say. We discussed, I think, on podcast a few weeks ago when me and Eliav filled in for Pesach.
Thank you for that, by the way.
So fun. But we discussed this idea of like the Shin Bet's kind of corporate culture, right? Like, do they have kind of a corporate ethos of that can stand against an onslaught like this? And it's kind of like Eliav was saying, like, yes, like he doesn't think things are gonna, in his like expert political analysis opinion, doesn't think things are gonna fall apart immediately. But like organizations are made up of people. People hold a variety of opinions. Like you need the institution itself to be strong and have its independence.
Yeah. I think that kind of understanding of a need for checks and balances, for separation of powers, is so inherent to the concept of democracy as a whole, and the blurring of those lines that's we've been seeing in the, you know, Shin Bet like security executive side versus like the Knesset, and in the judicial versus the Knesset, like that constant I guess, fight that's happening. It's blurring the lines way too much, and that's extremely concerning. And I know a lot of people are concerned about that right now. But I do want to turn real quick to like the.
Wait, we didn't talk about the Pope dying at all.
Well, that's where I was going.
I don't believe you, but okay, go.
The Pope died.
The Pope did die. The Pope died, and Israel tweeted about it.
Israel's foreign ministry tweeted about it and then deleted that tweet
it.
in what was one of the most embarrassing.
A really bad look for us.
It did not look great. And the reason supposedly that they did that, I mean, like, obviously they haven't said anything, but, you know, the reason supposedly that they did that is that the Pope was very critical of Israel in this war.
But also, let's not forget the Pope has been an advocate for the hostages from the very beginning.
An advocate for the hostages from the very beginning. He's been an advocate combating anti-Semitism since the very beginning. He went to Yad Vashem, and Dani Dayan is going to talk about that soon. He went there and talked about like the importance of combating anti-Semitism. He was a fighter for people's rights.
I just think it's part of this thing,
and I don't think it's mutually exclusive that you
exactly
can, like, if you care about Palestinians, you can't. Now, fair, like, there are things that I think overstepped. There are things that I think were exaggerated. The
baby Jesus kafia.
The baby Jesus kafia was one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. That is an overstep. Nevertheless, those things aren't mutually exclusive.
It's part of this like extremist us versus them mentality, black or white. You're either with us or against us. You do one thing against us, you're burned. And
it's really funny because it's a kind of woke mentality that Israelis, for the most part, have acted very opposed to, and then use that same logic.
We've been doing this for so long. We as the Israelis, like we're so big on like, she said one thing that I don't like, or that's too left wing for me, that's too pro-Palestinian for me, she's out, she's burned.
I heard somebody get mad because they heard Dua Lipa on the radio.
Let's not. It's ridiculous. Also, I think that
you may not like her, but her songs are a bop.
Our former ambassador to the Vatican said it best. He was like, deleting the tweet was bad. Why are we keeping the score with dead people? What are we doing? Actually, what are we doing?
Correct. That is correct. But this podcast episode is actually coming out on Holocaust Remembrance Day. Different from Holocaust Memorial Day, which is the international day. Holocaust Remembrance Day is the Israeli date. It hits home for a lot. Probably not as close experientially as next week's Memorial Day.
Yeah.
But nevertheless close. I know that a lot of my family was wiped out.
I was thinking about Dani El-Garatz. I never know if I'm saying his last name right. His brother Itzik was killed in captivity, and he fought so hard to bring him home. And at his funeral, so Danny's been wearing a yellow patch, a yellow star, since I think that says like 7th of October 23, like 7/10/23. Wow. And he's been wearing it kind of from very early on. And at the funeral, he took it off his chest. He said that this is for you. You were the one killed in the Holocaust of October 7th, and put it on his brother's coffin. It was an incredibly just awful moment. And of course, like, we won't get into making comparisons right or wrong. There's a ton of opinions out there. But for so many people, this day hits as
that exact same note.
Exactly. Yeah. They feel they've been through a Holocaust of their own, and they feel they're still going through it for some of the hostage families. Yeah. And so, I think that's got to bring so much meaning tomorrow.
Yeah, I know that my grandparents are really lovely people, and they are wonderful, and they did so much for this country, and they are Holocaust survivors, and it very clearly hit some note where they were like, it was bringing them back. It was bringing them back, and I'm sure to Holocaust survivors, there's few left today. On the subject of Holocaust Remembrance Day, I will transition into our interview for this week with Editor-in-Chief Zvika Klein, interviewing Chairman of Yad Vashem, Dani Dayan.
Shalom, Dani Dayan.
Shalom, Zvika Klein.
So we're recording on a Wednesday, the eve of Yom HaShoah. This is probably the most busy day of the year for you. So the Holocaust has, it always is relevant in the lives of Jews and definitely Israelis. And I want to actually start with October 7th because you've made a few statements about this that many Israelis will compare the Holocaust to October 7th. And there are lots of similarities. And there were certain diplomats and politicians who made those comparisons, and you spoke up against it.
Let me start with the summer of 2022. In June 2022, President Joe Biden came to Yad Vashem, and I was his host. And I thought, what will be the first thing I will tell the President of the United States when he arrives? And I escort him to the Hall of Remembrance. There were the President, the Prime Minister waiting for him. And I decided to tell him two things. The first one is that Israel was not established, was not created because of the Shoah, but in spite of the Shoah. It's not a consolation prize that the world gave us and they can take from us.
But it did encourage it, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because we had to fight for our independence in the weakest point in our history.
Right.
So I think that it was established despite it, in spite of the Shoah. But that's not the relevant point I wanted to make. The second thing I told the president is, Mr. President, if we want to understand Israel, and you want to understand the individual Israelis and the Israeli society and the Israeli leadership, how they make decisions, you should know that the Shoah is omnipresent in the back of our minds, in our individual minds and our collective minds. And then came October 7th, and we were glued to the TV screens, listening to the reports that mothers were muffling the mouths of their toddlers in order to prevent them from crying and be discovered by the assailants. And I think that every single Israeli, every single Jew, probably many human beings, immediately thought about similar stories. In barns in Ukraine, when the SS was roaming outside,
children hiding in
or
closets,
in the attics in Amsterdam, or etc. So this, of course, that came to our minds immediately. But then came October 8th and 9th and November, December 2024, 2025. The differences are huge. You can't compare any pair, any couple of events, historical events are comparable with one condition, that you say what are the similarities and what are the differences.
Yeah.
The similarities exist, as you said, the cruelty, the sadism, the intention was genocidal, but the differences are huge. And the main difference that makes October 7th a completely separate, not a continuation, not Shoah 2.0, is that we are not anymore at the mercy of others.
Right.
During the Shoah, the maximum we could do was to beg Roosevelt and Churchill to bomb the railways conducting to
or to protest, but not more than that.
And October 7th, October 8th, and on, we do what we consider necessary to do. The heroism of the Kitot Konenut, the first responders in the kibbutzim, of course, is no less than the heroism of Mordechai Anilevich and Pavel Frenkel in the ghetto. But the purpose was completely different.
Right.
They fought in order to die with dignity, and these guys fought in order to save lives. That's a completely different, but I will tell you more than that. It's also dangerous to make that comparison, because what is terror? Terror is the desire to terrorize the population of your adversary, of your enemy. By admitting that we are again in the hallways that conduct to the gas chambers, we play into the hands of Hamas. That's what Hamas wants. So I think that objectively, and even from a from a tactical point of view, it's a huge mistake to make that comparison. It's completely wrong.
Yeah. But you can't ignore the fact that after the Holocaust, and you said, despite the Holocaust, maybe the state of Israel was born, but for many decades, and surveys showed it and research that the Holocaust, the Shoah, was for some people the most significant part in their Jewish identities. And nowadays, many people, many Jews in Israel and around the world had an awakening in what they call in the US, the October 8th Jews, or the surge of Judaism after October 7th. And we see it in so many places. So it definitely has, like, both of them have this something that causes a, I don't know.
Of course, I can offer you a list of similarities.
No, I'm not saying similarities. I'm asking you.
I'm
not asking for similar. I'm curious how you see this as a former diplomat, as chairman of Yad Vashem.
I can also offer a list of common consequences of the Shoah and October 7th, but doesn't make the. Now, to your question, the Zvika, that when I returned from New York serving as consul general, we had many talks about that. I became in New York even more passionate than I was before that for Israeli diaspora relationship, Israeli war Jewry relationship.
I don't know if we could say here, by the way, before you went, we had coffee, and you said, "I don't know enough."
Yeah.
And you wanted to learn.
Yeah.
And you came back, and now you're like the expert.
I
was amazing.
I grew up in a Jewish community,
a very different Jewish community
in Argentina, but
right.
But I most of my life I lived in Israel, and in some ways I forgot what it means to be a Jew in the diaspora. But for me, to serve as Israel's consul general in New York was an incredible experience also in that sense. I became very passionate about, and that at a certain time I thought that I want to be chairman of the Jewish Agency, and
boy, do I know.
I'm glad I didn't, but that's another story.
I'm happy for you too.
But the interesting thing is, when I came back from New York, there were only a handful of positions I would have taken. I was already 65 or 66, and there were only a handful of positions. Yad Vashem was one of them. Why Yad Vashem was one of them? Probably at the top of the list, because unfortunately, it's not a desirable situation, but unfortunately, politics divide the Jewish people.
Yeah.
Religion divides the Jewish people.
Okay.
Reforms, Orthodox, Kotel, etc., conversion, etc., etc. And the Shoah remembrance unites the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I want also to use Yad Vashem as a tool for the unity of the Jewish people. That is extremely important for me. Again, I'm not saying that's the ideal situation. I would like other issues, more positive, to unite the Jewish people. But given the situation in which there are breaks and differences and gaps in the Jewish people, I think that we have also, in that sense, an historic task, an historic mission.
100%. And for those that don't know you, you have many hats that you wore throughout the years, and I think that's why in a sense, and you keep it very under the radar. I think you're you're a bridge in your character, and behind the scenes in many rooms here in Yad Vashem, things happen that have positivity to connect, and I think that's something that we don't have enough of lately. So you spoke about unity and the Holocaust, but actually, and we spoke about this, before the interview, and I know from my wife's family, so I'm 5 generations in America, no Holocaust connection that we know of. Obviously there is, but and my wife's family, so one side is Hungarian and the other side is Polish. Now the Polish look down at the Hungarians right? I know Hungarians who used to say we would come to Yad Vashem, decades ago, and say we want to publish a book, we want to do a movie about our lives. Amazing stories, by the way, and and then people Yad Vashem would be like, "You guys were in the Holocaust, like you were 3 months in Auschwitz." You know what I'm saying? And then my wife's grandmother, who's Polish, was there for 3 years. And within Israeli society, it was a major part, and also the acceptance of them wasn't easy. Nowadays, we look at them as heroes, and I know you're not going to like that I'm comparing again to October 7th, but we see the heroes of October 7th as, or the hostages, the returnees as heroes, but then not so much.
We have this tendency today when we really analyze the Israeli society with a scalpel, and we have this I don't know this thing that we really become naked and with criticism and etc., and we tend to romanticize the early years of the state of Israel, the late 40s and the early 50s, and in some senses with good reason. But in other senses, there is nothing to miss. And one of the things is the shameful, I will use a loaded word, the shameful way that the Israeli society received the Sherita Plita, the Holocaust survivors to Israel. Why did you go to the slaughterhouse without resisting?
Wow.
And
That's a big,
using
yeah.
the Jewish, the Hebrew term ketzon latevach. Even there were insulting names that I really don't want even to repeat, that were attributed. Mickey Goldman, a police officer, a survivor that was the head of the unit in the Israeli police that investigated Adolf Eichmann. In the trial of Adolf Eichmann, another person, not Goldman himself, who was in the prosecution bench, told a story about a young Jewish boy in a ghetto in Poland that received 80 slashes. And he barely survived. And that boy was Mickey Goldman.
Oh, wow.
And then Chaim Guri, the poet, asked Mickey Goldman, why didn't you tell that story? I never heard that story from you. And Goldman says, who is today 99, I want to wish him good health for many, many more years. Mickey Goldman said, of course I did tell the story when I arrived to Israel, but nobody believed me. And Chaim Guri said, that was the 81st slash. So today we understand how wrong that was. Today we understand that the Jewish woman that with the most rudimentary things managed to look somewhat better, to put some makeup, thus contradicting the will of the Nazis to deprive her from any sense of being a human being. She was a hero, no more, but no less than a fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto. And a Jewish man that managed to put tefillin in the camp was when the Nazis want to deprive him from any sense of being Jew, was a hero no less than a partisan in the woods. Today we understand that. Then, unfortunately, the Israeli society didn't. I'm so happy, so glad that we cured them from that situation, from that.
So the issue of Holocaust around the world nowadays in many countries is very mainstream, right? For instance, Germany, right? You'll see it in schools. People are learning about it, people live it, um, German politicians or media, you see something so pro-Jewish or Israel in a very unique way because they understand the sense that Israel needs a Jewish state after the Holocaust. But many other countries or places, it's starting to people are asking questions. Did it actually happen? The Jews are exaggerating, so there's this the definition and the group of countries, right? So the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. I think I
That's
got that
correct.
right. Okay, former Jewish diaspora reporter. So basically, a definition that has a bunch of examples, but mainly I think also saying that if you don't acknowledge an existence of a Jewish state or of Israel, then that could be considered anti-Semitism. And the IRA is a group of how many countries?
35.
35 countries.
And 8 observers.
It's a task force, right? That each country has their own internal team, whether in the foreign ministry or I don't know if it's the prime minister's office, depending on the country. So what are this? And you are now the chairman.
I am the chairman of IRA.
So every year it goes from country to country, and now Israel
is has the presidency. I am the chair of the presidency.
Right. So what's the state like? What are the discussions there?
Well, you asked many questions. I will try to answer all of them.
Only 6.
First of all, regarding Germany, I visited Germany for the first time in my life as chairman of Yad Vashem.
Right.
I never visited Germany. It was a decision I made as a very young boy.
You went to the Bundestag.
But then I decided that when I received an invitation from the Bundestag, I decided that I will serve the task of memory better by going than by refraining from going. And I have quite close relationships both with the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the person that seems that will be shortly the Chancellor Friedrich Merz. And I told them both that in some sentence I will contradict what you just said. I told them both that I appreciate tremendously, I really do, the work that they do, both parties, the socialists and the Christian Democrats, in Holocaust remembrance and commitment and the obligations that come with that as for Germany. But the real test, the real challenge is to make that commitments of the leadership trickle down to the civil society. And when Germany, like many other countries, became a multi-ethnic, multicultural societies, that is more difficult than ever. And I offered also our help, and I offered Chancellor Scholz that Yad Vashem will open its first educational center outside of Israel in Germany.
Oh, wow.
He immediately agreed. We have also the backing of Friedrich Merz. As a matter of fact, he's even explicitly backed in the new coalition agreement in Germany. So it's going to happen. It's going to happen soon. We will open our first educational center outside of Israel in Germany. The good news, and there are not many good news in this area.
In this industry. Shoah business.
The good news is that outright Shoah denial is quite marginal today.
Okay.
Of course, you can find it in the lunatic fringes of Twitter and the social media, but outright, no serious leader, except probably in Malaysia or in Iran or in the Islamic universities in somewhere, you will find outright denial. But outright denial, no serious person in the world, it was for sure in the Western world, will not deny the Holocaust. But the danger, the threat that we are posing now is rampant Holocaust distortion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so dangerous because it's usually backed by very, very strong political or social forces, in many cases by governments.
Mm-hmm.
And the narrative in many cases goes this way. Of course that Holocaust happened, and of course the gas chambers existed and millions of Jews were murdered. But in my country, all the citizens tried to help the Jews. There were only a few collaborators, but which of course, except maybe for Albania, that is a complete fallacy.
And also a smaller Jewish community.
Yeah,
it's not.
of course. And it's not only, if you think it's only in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet bloc, no, it's also in Western Europe. We saw a presidential candidate in France claiming that the Vichy regime was benevolent towards the Jews, which of course is. And we see, for instance, even this week, in Latvia, for instance, glorification or at least exoneration of war criminals, local war criminals, because they are considered shamefully heroes in their country because they also fought the communists.
Right.
I had the privilege to be invited to deliver a keynote speech in the plenary of the Lithuanian parliament in a few days before October 7th, 2023, to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the liquidation of the Vilna ghetto. And I told them an anti-Semite is an anti-Semite is an anti-Semite, and he cannot be an otherwise a good person, especially if he was a butcher of Jews. And I made explicit names that should be erased from the Hall of Fame of Lithuania.
Oh, wow. So in an IRA, maybe give us a brief kind of update about what's going on in that sphere.
It's quite a unique organization. 35 governments, most of them Europeans, but 30 of them are European governments, but 5 of them are non-Europeans: the United States, Canada, Australia, Argentina, and Israel, united forces in order to remember the Holocaust. Yes, there is also the famous working definition of anti-Semitism, which is very famous in the diplomatic world and in the media, but in IRA is less central. IRA is about
Holocaust education.
And the interesting thing in IRA is that to become a member of IRA, you should show as a priori.
You need to prove a number of...
You need to show that you do things.
Right.
That you have an educational curriculum regarding Holocaust remembrance, that you have exhibitions, that you safeguard sites, historical sites in which... So it's not obvious. It's not obvious that 35 countries, 8 observers, united forces, governments, united forces in order to do that. We should keep it. I think it's a huge interest also of the Jewish people, also to keep it apolitical,
right?
Not to try to use it for other matters.
And many people try.
Yeah. I will tell you very sincerely, Zvika, even here in Yad Vashem, I have pressures by, in Israel, I don't mean inside Yad Vashem, to put Yad Vashem at the service of Israeli Hasbara in matters that are not related directly to the Holocaust. And the moment we will do that, we will lose completely our credibility. There were many cases in which there were contradictions, clashes. between the Israeli diplomatic interest with certain country and historical truth. And I can assure you that as long as I am chairman of Yad Vashem, we will be in the side of historical truth.
So Dani, so I mean, you mentioned different people trying to use Yad Vashem for their own interests. And I'm sure it's from different aspects and different countries, religions, etc. But there are a matter of incidents, even in the past year or two, of different politicians from extreme right parties or parties with a very Nazi supporting or Nazi affiliation parties from Europe or other countries. They want to come to Yad Vashem. Some of them were allowed in. I think some were maybe not allowed in.
No, there is no
They're all
case,
out. They're all allowed
There
in.
is no case in which it prevented a person from entering Yad Vashem.
But there was criticism on certain of them.
Every person that wants to visit Yad Vashem can visit.
Just comes.
Even the entrance is free.
Right.
That, of course, the moment he crosses the gates of Yad Vashem, he has to behave in a certain way. And according to our procedures. And of course, we will not let a person with Nazi symbols to roam Yad Vashem, but any person, we do not vet, have a vetting process for regarding official visits. There were cases in which there were requests, even by members of parliament, to lay wreaths or do a specific ceremony which goes beyond the visit to Yad Vashem, and we didn't allow that.
Right. So, what is your or Yad Vashem's approach to parties who are extreme right or but who stand up and say we want to, I don't know, we don't deny our past, we acknowledge it and we denounce it.
We had many cases like this in which each case we approach it differently. I was very clear, for instance, when Mr. Elon Musk said in an AfD rally in Germany, he spoke via
extreme right party,
and he said that Germany should abandon basically its memory culture, existing memory culture. And he didn't say it this way, but forget about the Holocaust and not make it a central part in their
culture,
being in their culture. I condemn that outrightly. I also said, without any reservations, that the rise of the AfD in Germany is a shame for Germany. There was, for instance, another case, probably I'm revealing here a secret, but there was a case in Romania in which our ambassador was given instructions from headquarters to meet the leader of an extreme right-wing party that glorify, some of its members at least glorify war criminals like Antonescu and others, and even one of its members said that the curriculum for Holocaust studies in Romania should not be applied because it's a small thing, a small event, the Holocaust. I want to remind you that the Holocaust in Romania is quite unique in the sense that it was done mostly by Romanians. And we gave the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a set of conditions that should be met before that meeting takes place. Unfortunately, they weren't met, and meeting took place, and we were quite outspoken criticizing.
So it's on a case basis.
It's on a case, exactly.
Right. So we have to almost, finish. Um, and it's interesting, I remember seeing you in Malmo, Sweden during an IRA forum or whatever. And I was so surprised to see that in every country around the world, the chairman of Yad Vashem, regardless of who it is, right, is treated as a head of state. So there's like a whole, it's a whole thing. But it also shows the acknowledgement and the centrality of Yad Vashem. So I'm wondering, so basically you meet with heads of state.
Yeah, every place, almost every country I visit, I meet the head of state, the head of government, yeah.
Right. So,
including an extraordinary meeting I had
with
2
Javier
years
Milei.
ago. No, with Javier Milei was recently, but with Pope Francis, another
Okay.
Argentinian.
Okay.
In the Vatican, I had a private audience, which is the highest level meeting with Pope Francis. Obviously, we spoke in our Mamelucian in Spanish.
Yeah.
From Buenos Aires with
the same accent,
exactly,
or whatever,
the same
yeah.
dialect, the same accent. And there are many things that are said about Pope Francis, but I want to say that when I asked him to open the archives of the Vatican in the relevant era for our researchers, he immediately gave the green light, and he said the church is not afraid of history. He also asked me to see him as an ally in the war against anti-Semitism, and he arranged for me interviews in the Vatican radio station to say that he told me that. So it was a very emotional meeting.
And diplomacy, it's a very complicated situation because he also wasn't very positive towards Israel in the past few years. But so just to conclude, so when you meet heads of state, what is your sense? Let's say in the past year and a half, 2 years, the sense of Holocaust acknowledgement and education in these countries and in the leadership, but also of Israel, because we as Israelis we always tend to think that everyone hates us.
I will tell you what I told a man that became even I can say a close personal friend of mine. We use first names already. The former Chancellor of Austria,
Sebastian Kurz.
Karl Nehammer. He's the successor of Kurz. Mm-hmm. And I had a tete-a-tete with him, and I remember that was when there were talks in Vienna with Iran in order to renew the JCPOA. And I told him, Chancellor, I'm not an expert on uranium or enrichment. I have no idea what it means to enrich uranium. But I will tell you why I cried, I shed tears when the JCPOA was signed in Vienna from all places. And he told me why. I told him because I don't understand uranium, but I understand anti-Semitism. But I couldn't imagine in my worst dream nightmares that 70-something years after the Shoah, in Vienna from all places, the Secretary of State of the United States, the Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, the High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs of the European Union will stand and smile and embrace the foreign minister of a country that calls for the annihilation of the Jewish state, for anti-Semitic. For me, that was terrible. Not the JCPOA.
And it says the Holocaust didn't exist.
Exactly. So I sincerely didn't believe that it can happen 70-something years after the Shoah, in Vienna from all places. Karl Nehammer was somewhat embarrassed by that, but it was beyond his control. Vienna was only the
I
hosting
think
place.
it's
But I
it's an
must,
important thing to say.
yeah,
Dani Dayan, thank you so much.
thank you.
I know you have a really long day ahead of you, but it's so important. And let's hope for positive things to come out
Amen.
of this time in history. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Jerusalem Post podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to leave it a like, comment, subscribe. You can find us on JPost Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Instagram. We're all over these days, or anywhere you get your podcasts or videos. Be well.